It's bad for the country. That is how President Trump is describing the special counsel probe into Russian collusion. Good evening, everyone. I am Trish Regan, in for Martha MacCallum. In a freewheeling, all-access interview with the New York Times, a paper that often criticizes the president for being hostile towards the press, the president spoke candidly about the probe, vehemently denying any wrongdoing and offering a surprising assessment of Robert Mueller, saying, quote, "I can only tell you that there is absolutely no collusion. Everybody knows it. And you know who knows it better than anyone? The Democrats. They walk around blinking at each other. It doesn't bother me because I hope that Mueller's going to be fair. I think that he's going to be fair." And while the president is relying on a, quote, fair probe, many on the Hill doubt that's even possible. In just moments, we'll be joined by one of the lawmakers calling for Robert Mueller to be fired, Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. But first, Fox's Rich Edson has more on the president's bombshell new interview from Florida.
President Trump is taking a much softer approach to special counsel Robert Mueller and his investigation into possible collusion with the Russian government during the 2016 election. The president, in a 30-minute interview with the New York Times, denied there was any collusion with the Russian government and his campaign more than a dozen times. He says, quote, "I hope he's going to be fair. I think he's going to be fair. There's no collusion, and even if there was, it's not a crime. But there's no collusion." President Trump then turned to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her thousands of deleted emails. The New York Times reporter asked the president if he thought the Department of Justice should again investigate the former Secretary of State. The president said, quote, "What I've done is I have absolute right to do what I want to do with the Justice Department, but for purposes of hopefully thinking I'm going to be treated fairly, I've stayed uninvolved in this particular matter." President Trump then turned to his domestic agenda, says he wants Democrats and Republicans to work together on a host of issues, including immigration and DACA, the Obama-era provision that protects the so-called Dreamers, those brought to the United States illegally as children. The president tweeted this morning, quote, "The Democrats have been told and fully understand that there can be no DACA without the desperately needed wall at the southern border and an end to the horrible chain migration and ridiculous lottery system of immigration, etc. We must protect our country at all cost." Later in the afternoon, President Trump invited dozens of service members from the United States Coast Guard to come to Trump International Golf Club for a 4-person scramble. The president said he wanted to invite them and thank them for their work during hurricane season, particularly in Florida and in Texas. Trish, back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Rich. Here right now, one of the Republicans calling for Robert Mueller to be fired, Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Good to see you, Representative. So you say he's got to go. Why?
Well, the context of this investigation demonstrates a tremendous amount of bias. If you look at just the timeline, Robert Mueller was interviewing, wanting to get his old job back as the head of the FBI on the 16th of May. Rod Rosenstein then walked him out of that interview, and within 24 hours, Rosenstein appoints Mueller to go and investigate the president. Mueller then populates his team with people who dislike the president. Over half of them gave money to Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, or both. And the number 2 person in this investigation, Mr. Weissman, actually attended Hillary Clinton's non-victory party. So there are a lot of things that evidence bias to me. But what's most important about President Trump's interview, these are the actions of an innocent man. He goes on the record, on a recording, to say, no collusion, ask your questions. I think the president demonstrated his innocence, and it's time to wrap this up so it doesn't become a real dampening feature on the great 2018 we can have in this country.
Well, you know, it has become very political, and that's perhaps the scariest part of this. I mean, if Russia wanted to mess with us, shall we say, they've been successful in at least everyone's upset now, everyone's concerned, and both sides are fighting with each other. So I understand you want Mr. Mueller to resign, but is there anyone, Representative Gaetz, that you would be okay with leading that probe? Or does the probe itself need to go away?
Well, I think that if there is evidence of collusion, let's see it. If not, let's move on as a country. But if you're asking whether there's anyone who would be qualified to be independent, I think you could at least start by not appointing a person that was passed over trying to get their own job back within 24 hours of their appointment as special prosecutor. I think that if you're picking a number two, there are a lot of talented prosecutors in our federal system. Could we maybe start with someone who didn't attend Hillary Clinton's victory party? And oh, by the way, when we're drafting investigators into into the probe, can maybe we not have someone like Peter Strzok, who has demonstrated excessive pro-Hillary Clinton bias and anti-Donald Trump bias? Those things taint this investigation. They prove that no successful prosecution will come from this investigation of the president. And I think that it's refreshing that the president welcomes a conclusion to this so that we can get on with the important work we have to do for the American people.
I think everybody would like a conclusion, but I think everybody still has a lot of questions. And it's not just whether or not the president had colluded during his campaign with the Russians. It's what exactly Hillary Clinton may or may have not done and her campaign with the Russians. I mean, you go back to that dossier, Representative, and it's clear that the Russians may have actually had a hand in that one. And that kind of misinformation that possibly our law enforcement took seriously enough to potentially issue wiretaps. I mean, that's where it starts to really break down. And I think on both sides, a lot of questions need answering.
No, I completely agree. There are things that we absolutely know, and then there are areas where we still need answers. We absolutely know that the DNC paid a company to pay Russians to tell lies about the president. We also absolutely know that Hillary Clinton had complete command and control over the DNC. That's not what Republicans say. That's what Donna Brazile says. We still don't know whether or not the FBI was working with the DNC to buy that dossier, and we don't know whether or not it was used as an intelligence document to authorize wiretaps against the president's team. That's why the work that Chairman Devin Nunes is doing is so important. He's issued subpoenas, but the Department of Justice and the FBI have been recalcitrant. It's almost like Jeff Sessions needs to change his middle name from Beauregard to Disregard, because too many people at the FBI and at Justice have been disregarding the very legitimate requests from Congress to get information to answer these questions for the American people.
All right, before I go, should the president fire him?
I think that the Attorney General should fire Robert Mueller. The president should keep his hands off of it, do exactly what he's doing, but we need the Attorney General to do his job, acknowledge the fact that there's excessive bias, and then act on it.
Thank you so much, Representative Gates. Good to see you tonight. Here now with more, Jonathan Turley, constitutional attorney and George Washington University law professor. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Do you think it's time for Mueller to step aside?
No. I didn't think that Mueller was a good choice for special counsel. I said that at the time, for many of the reasons the congressman noted. But I've never questioned his integrity, and I think that he will do a fair job. If nothing else, history will be his judge, and he knows that. If you're going to take on a president, you better get it right, and I think he will. But he is the special counsel we have. I think if you fire Robert Mueller, you will magnify this problem exponentially. It is precisely what happened after Comey was fired. Many of us did not support a special counsel until that happened. But then at that point, the American people had a right to expect an independent investigation. And the president's right. None of this is good for the country. But what would be worse is to leave these questions unanswered on either side, whether it's the Trump allegations or the Clinton allegations.
No, understandably. I mean, there are plenty of questions on both sides to go around. But let me ask you this, Jonathan. You heard what Representative Gates was saying. His concern is that there is too much bias within Robert Mueller's team. In other words, he assembled people, and I don't know why they can't find anyone in Washington that hasn't donated to the DNC or to Hillary Clinton, but these are people that had made donations to her. And now we have text messages between one intelligence officer and an FBI officer, and it was clear the bias there, where they're talking about an insurance policy against Donald Trump should he become president. I mean, if you're going to run a team, don't you want to make sure that that team is above reproach?
Well, I really think that Mueller can be rightfully criticized for some of the people he selected. I agree. You can throw a stick on any corner in D.C. and hit 20 lawyers at any given time. And many of those people don't have connections to either party. But at the end of the day, we've got to sort of stop and say, you know, maybe both Democrats and Republicans should accept that the American people is divided about the same percentage that doesn't trust one investigation, doesn't trust the other investigation. And what you have then is a country that really needs answers, or we're not going to get closure. This is the type of thing that's really damaging to a democratic system. People really wonder whether the election was fair, but also whether these investigations are fair. The only solution is to do an independent investigation down to the marrow and show people that nothing was left unexplored, uninvestigated, and there was transparency in the end. I don't think there are crimes here. At least I don't see any evidence. You know, the crimes that were with the basis of the indictments and pleas, those were people who made false statements or they're unrelated to the Trump campaign. But whether there's crimes or not, I just think we need an answer and we need conclusions.
Yeah, and perhaps it would be good for the president to get out in front of this and insist that we drill down and we get these answers, because we need them on all sides. Let me ask you about something else that, frankly, has deteriorated people's faith in our system, and that was Hillary Clinton's use of her own private server, and James Comey effectively saying that, you know, no big deal. But yet, a big deal. Yeah. Walking both ways there. Huma Abedin, 2,800 emails were discovered on her former husband. I don't know the status of them just yet right now, but her estranged husband, we can say, Anthony Weiner. His computer had 2,800 emails of hers, a number of which were considered classified. So we're once again back at this issue of, I don't know how people in government think it's okay to be sending classified information over a home computer, but we're back at that.
You know, just as I've said that people should let Mueller finish his work, I also think it's strange for Democrats to say, oh, don't investigate this, the election is over, except, of course, for the Trump election. And so I don't get why people are bothered by Congress exercising oversight authority to look into this. I can tell you, as a criminal defense attorney, the Clinton staff got an enormous amount of deference. Deals were made to destroy computers, immunity deals, just as a condition of turning over government property. None of that really makes a lot of sense. Now, in the end, is there a crime? Probably not. But once again, I think the public has a right to answers as to how its government performed.
Well said. Good to see you, Jonathan. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Still ahead tonight, why 2 California professors say that those farmers markets in your community are actually racist. And how the Las Vegas massacre is changing the way police are preparing to keep you safe when you ring in the new year. But first, there's breaking news tonight on North Korea. We have just learned that it is not just the Chinese who are secretly helping the rogue regime and breaking UN sanctions. Russia is reportedly doing the same. Ambassador John Bolton is here next on how the White House should respond.
I think you will see increased pressure. What form that pressure takes in terms of physical operations is something that will be determined.
Breaking tonight, Russia now accused of secretly providing fuel to North Korea. It comes a day after President Trump accused China of doing the same thing in a direct violation of UN sanctions. Fox's Lucas Tomlinson is live at the Pentagon with the breaking developments. Hi, Lucas.
Trish, Russian smugglers have been accused of supplying illegal oil to North Korea on at least 3 different occasions at sea recently. Russia's largest port is not far from the 11-mile border shared with North Korea. Moscow's involvement is unclear. Today, Defense Secretary Mattis told reporters to expect more actions against North Korea in the coming year.
I think you will see increased pressure. What form that pressure takes in terms of physical operations is something that will be determined.
South Korea says it seized a cargo ship last month, claiming the vessel was illegally transferring 600 tons of oil at sea, an action prohibited by a UN resolution passed in September. The Hong Kong-class vessel Lighthouse Winmore entered a South Korea port on October 11th to fill up with oil. But instead of heading south to Taiwan as scheduled, the ship rendezvoused with a North Korean vessel a week later. The transfer captured by U.S. spy satellites and released by the U.S. Treasury Department last month. But before blaming the Chinese, President Trump was praising them last month while visiting Beijing.
I thank President Xi for his recent efforts to restrict trade with North Korea and to cut off all banking ties. Mr. President, thank you, and thank you to all of the Chinese business leaders here today for standing with the United States and our coalition of responsible nations.
In an interview with the New York Times, President Trump now says he's been too soft on China. Beijing denies any involvement with this ship, despite being registered in Hong Kong and leased to a company in Taiwan.
China has conducted immediate investigation into the case mentioned in reports. In fact, the related ship has never berthed in any Chinese ports since August of 2017.
I asked Secretary Mattis if he was impressed with the advancements made with North Korea's missile program this year. Mattis replied, "I'm not easily impressed." Trish?
Good one. All right. Thank you very much, Lucas. Here now, John Bolton. He's the former U.S. ambassador to the UN and a Fox News contributor. Ambassador Bolton, good to see you again.
Glad to be with you.
All right. The president says basically these guys were caught red-handed. This is the tweet he sent out where he specifically says, caught red-handed, very disappointed that China is allowing oil to go into North Korea. There will never be a friendly solution to the North Korea problem if this continues to happen. And now we know Russia's there, able and willing to do the same. What happened to all the sanctions they signed on to?
Well, I don't think they were ever terribly serious about them. I think what happens in the Security Council is a lot of virtue signaling by some countries, and I think both China and Russia clearly have interest in keeping the North Korean regime propped up. Other governments do as well. I think Iran's a good example of that. So it's disappointing, but hardly surprising that we see these breaches of the sanctions resolutions. And it really leads to the question, is there anything else in terms of economic sanctions on North Korea that's going to make any difference? And I'm afraid, given North Korea's progress in terms of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, the answer to that's no.
Which leaves you where? What would our policy then be if we can't do anything more in the way of sanctions?
Well, I think the president tried to impress on China that we're really tired of their 25 years of playing around with this issue. The Chinese have long said we don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but they have not done what they have the capability to do, in effect, to prevent it. So I think now the pressure really is on China. I think the president was very candid when he said, look, I left them alone on some of the trade issues because I wanted more effort on North Korea. That obviously didn't happen. So China's got to deliver in a very short period of time, or we face an unattractive, very unattractive binary choice. Either we leave North Korea with deliverable nuclear weapons, or we have to look at the use of military force.
But isn't there some in between in here? In other words, the president's saying, look, I left them alone on trade. Well, why leave them alone on trade? If they're not doing what we need them to do, and by all accounts, they have the most intelligence on that regime and have the ability to either move him aside or really encourage him to denuclearize himself, why not actually start to invoke some of these economic measures when it comes to trade?
Look, if this were 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, there might be something to that. The problem now, and we've seen in the past year with North Korea, by all accounts, in its 6th nuclear test, getting a thermonuclear device successfully fired, and in the progress it's made on ballistic missiles, that they're so close now to crossing that finish line, to being able to hit targets really all around the world, that by the time you mobilize and apply the sanctions effort, North Korea will have succeeded in getting the capability.
Perhaps I'm not clear. I'm not even talking just sanctions. I'm talking sanctions on steroids, as in a good old-fashioned trade war where we say, you know what, China, you're not going to be able to do business with us, and China needs us, Ambassador. You know, you think about China's surplus in trade, 68% of that surplus comes from the good old USA. So if we say enough and we're not going to buy your goods anymore, period, I would think they'd get the message.
Yeah, if the president had the authority to do that, which I don't think he does, without congressional legislation. And, you know, the other reality is, although China obviously depends on our purchases in the United States for a considerable part of their economy, the two are linked together. That's why I've never believed the threat of China holding American debt could really put us on our knees. It goes both ways. And you can like this or not like this, but the American business community is not going to sign on willingly to cutting off access, sanctions on steroids, as you put it, to the Chinese market.
So again, you're telling me that their bottom line, their profits, are more important than their patriotism. and
That's
it's
exactly
more
what they would
important
tell
than their
you.
country.
Absolutely. They'd say, go pick on somebody else. You know the old tax slogan, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fella behind the tree? That's what they'd all say. Absolutely. Wow. Tough pressure on North Korea, just not pressure on me.
Well, you know, it doesn't seem entirely right. Sometimes you got to make some sacrifices, and maybe it's time American corporations be willing to make those sacrifices for the sake of the country.
Look, on your show next week, call in the head of J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs. Ask them how they'd like to cut off banking access to the Chinese market.
I don't care about them. I care about the country, and I care about the fact that there could be a nuclearized North Korea that could inflict pain on us. And, I just look at all of our options out there, Ambassador, and before we go straight to World War III, and believe me, we could, we ought to be willing to make these tough economic choices.
That isn't going to happen. But the question is, if you believe, and I think CIA Director Mike Pompeo basically said this, that North Korea is, let's say, within 6 months of being able to target the United States and actually hit the targets they aim for, you have to ask, how much damage could you do to China in that 6-month period? And I think the answer is precious little. I think you've got to go to China and argue their national interest is congruent with ours to getting rid of the regime in North Korea, reunifying the peninsula.
You know, you're right. And that is important to China. They should not want a crazy man there who could hurt them as much as he could hurt us. So that may be the winning argument in all of it. But anyway, it's always good to see you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Glad to be with you. Happy New Year.
Yes, you too. Coming up, everyone, our Power Panel takes a look back at some of the biggest accomplishments of the president's first year in office and what's to come in 2018. Plus, how the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history is changing the way police are preparing to protect you as you ring in the new year. Former LAPD Detective Mark Furman and former NYC Police Commissioner Bernie Kerik. They're here with some expert insight next. And this is a Fox News alert. Half the country could ring in 2018 with the coldest temperatures in more than half a century, making for some pretty dangerous conditions for those planning on braving the elements to celebrate this New Year's Eve. Chief Meteorologist Rick Reckman is live in the Fox Extreme Weather Center with the very cold forecast. Hey, Rick.
Yeah, it's a cold forecast, and it's a long forecast. It's going to remain cold. Temps obviously cold. Everybody's dealing with it. They have been for a few days. Overall, I will tell you, no major changes to this weather pattern we're in for probably, sorry to say, about the next 10 to 12 days. So we have a long ways to go. We also have snow, another clipper system diving here across parts of the western Great Lakes in towards the Ohio Valley tonight. And because the ground is so cold, it will all stick immediately and cause major problems along the roadways. Also places like Erie, Pennsylvania, that you've had one of your snowiest seasons. More snow, maybe about another foot throughout the weekend. Also out across the west, big rain moving into the Pacific Northwest, snow across the higher elevations. But we're going to continue to watch these temperatures drop. Minus 25 is what it feels like right now in Fargo. And that cold air is going to head towards parts of the Northeast behind this clipper system we're dealing with. This will bring us a little bit of snow tomorrow, 1 to 2 inches for almost everybody. And behind that, the cold air comes back in. That's going to set us up, Trish, for a New Year's Eve celebration right around 12 degrees.
Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to be inside right by the fire watching Fox News, and I'm going to enjoy seeing Kennedy and Jesse out there braving the cold.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Rick, I think. It's not just the weather that's a concern on New Year's Eve, obviously, but across the country, police are taking unprecedented security measures to keep us all very safe. All of this as the big holiday comes just 3 months after Las Vegas experienced the worst mass shooting in modern U.S. history. Fox's Brian Yanis is live in Times Square tonight with the story. Hi, Brian.
Good evening, Trish. Well, look, the NYPD says they are aware of an ISIS propaganda video released earlier this week that encourages followers to actually attack intoxicated New Year's Eve revelers. What the NYPD emphasizes, there is no specific credible threat to Times Square or New York City. Nonetheless, this will be the most secure event in Times Square's really history when it comes to New Year's Eve. More vaporwave dogs will be used than ever before to sniff out bombs in the air and on people, and more observation teams with snipers will be put on top of buildings. Also, more police officers will be used inside of the hotels and office towers overlooking Times Square, a response to the Las Vegas attack. But it's not just New York City. Boston is also doing the same thing.
You're going to see some observation offices up on rooftops, both along the waterfront and Copley Square. Unfortunately, that's a new reality after what happened in Las Vegas. We're going to have plenty of EOD bomb assets, whether they be dog and technicians out there.
And despite the weather and the concerns, there's also the preparations that are continuing. Today, confetti was dropped in a little bit of a test drop here in Times Square. 25 million pieces of confetti, 3 tons, will fall on over 1 million people expected to be here on Sunday night. By the way, the weather, 10 degrees will be here in New York City. It'll be very cold, so bundle up.
Oh, it's
Trish.
already very cold. It's getting even colder. Thank you so much, Brian, out there in the cold. Here now with more. Mark Furman is a former LAPD detective and is a Fox News contributor. And Bernie Carrick is the former New York City Police Commissioner. Good to see you both. I'm going to start first with you, Bernie. New York City, lots and lots of people, lots and lots of places for bad people to hide. We know that they're actually trying to ensure that rooftops at hotels are safe from snipers. Where do you begin in a case like this? Because you're trying to protect so many people, and there's so many things that could potentially happen.
Well, Trish, keep in mind, in 2001, in the aftermath of 9/11, that detail in Times Square was about 3,500 manpower. Today, it's in excess of 6,500, close to 7,000.
Okay.
You've got an enormous uniform presence. You have a plainclothes presence. You're going to have EOD personnel, explosives personnel with detection systems. You're going to have biochemical detection systems. You're going to have counter snipers on rooftops. As a result of Las Vegas, we're going to have surveillance teams that we really never had before. And you're going to have a saturation inside the hotels themselves, in and around Times Square, of emergency response personnel that are looking for suspicious packages, characters, and so forth.
Mark, let me ask you, how has Las Vegas and some of these other events changed the way law enforcement approaches these big events?
I'm not sure it's changed it at all. I think it's brought it a little bit more in focus. But, you know, you try to do the most to minimize the threat, but just, I hope you understand, you can minimize the threat, but you can't eliminate it. Just like Bernie's talking about in New York, with this 7,500-man detail, still would not stop Stephen Paddock inside of a residence or a hotel room getting off a significant amount of fire before they engaged him. So, you know, minimizing the threat is important and doing everything you can, but I think everybody should understand that they cannot absolutely say that they can eliminate any threat.
Yeah. I mean, do we need to change our approach to security overall? You think of a country like Israel, Bernie, that really, they go through various steps, additional steps. It can be kind of painful when you live there, but that's the reality of what they face. Much smaller country, obviously. Are we going to get to that point?
You know what, Trish, we're almost to that point as it is. The only thing we don't do is predictive and criminal profiling, a lot like Israel does, because here, everybody's scared to death. Somebody's going to say it's racial profiling.
Well,
but
hopefully that's coming to an end, though, Bernie.
Well,
that was in part, I think, why the president is where he is today, because people had it with
I've been pushing it for a year now. I think it's something that has to be done. Our intelligence capabilities are far better than they've ever been. And we're doing a lot of things here that Israel does. But keep in mind, like Mark said, somebody's going to slip through the cracks. They can. They do it in Israel. Israel's phenomenal at security. But they will get through the cracks if they try, and we lose sight of one.
Mark, let me ask you: are we any closer to figuring out what happened in Las Vegas? Who this guy was? And I mean, there's just so many open-ended questions, and I think that a lot of people feel like they want some closure here. They want to understand why it happened, and they want to know more about who he was and what triggered this.
Well, I think they want a motive. They want a motive because a motive gives them control, so they can actually do something to minimize their own threat, their own exposure, and quite possibly not become a victim. But Stephen Paddock had quite a sterile footprint, but the evidence that he did leave in that room, the one thing that is so extreme was the weapons and the way he acquired them in what amount of time. And I think perhaps that might be the statement that Stephen Paddock was attempting to prove or show or demonstrate the ease and the effective nature of a bump stock on a M4 platform. Is just a ridiculous amount of weapons. But this is what people can't wrap their mind around, why somebody would do this. But unfortunately, I don't think we're ever going to quite know the motive in this case.
All right. Well, let's hope everyone stays very safe this New Year's Eve. Thank you so much to both of you for being here.
Thank you.
Still to come, everyone. They've become a staple in almost every community. But now 2 California professors say farmers markets are racist. Wait till you hear their reasoning. Plus, as we get ready to ring in the new year, we take a look back at President Trump's biggest accomplishments during his first year in office. We got a power panel to break it all right down right here after this.
We share one heart, one home, and one glorious destiny. The oath of office I take today is an oath of allegiance to all Americans.
President Trump is set to wrap up his first year in office on, well, it's kind of a high note. Just a week ago, he signed that historic tax reform. It's one of his many accomplishments in 2017. Take a look.
January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. I've always heard that the most important thing that a president of the United States does is appoint people, hopefully great people like this appointment, to the United States Supreme Court. We will not allow American cities to be threatened with destruction. We will not be intimidated. I have determined that it is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The biggest tax cuts and reform in the history of our country. This is bigger than actually President Reagan's many years ago. I'm very honored by it.
Here now, Molly Hemingway, senior editor of The Federalist. Rachel Kempf-Duffy is a conservative commentator. Both are Fox News contributors. And also Wendy Osefo. She's a political commentator and professor at Johns Hopkins University. It's so good to see you all. Okay, so where to begin? I want to begin with tax reform. That was a biggie. Rachel, I gotta say, like after the whole repeal replace thing, it didn't really happen the way they thought it was. I was doubtful. I didn't know whether they'd be able to get tax reform through, but indeed, it happened.
It happened.
Big accomplishment.
It's big, and it's a big accomplishment. I'll tell you, failing on health care might have been what made the tax bill not only go through, but go through, I think, in a better way. I think they really did do what the bill was supposed to do, which was take the best of the House, the best of the Senate, and they even snuck in the Obamacare mandate repeal into that. I think there was a lot of pressure on Republicans. It was sort of do or die because their base, their voters, their donors were stinking mad at that.
Well, I can tell you, we've had more than 70 record highs in the Dow since the president came into office. And so that's a big deal. The market's excited about it. I think a lot of Americans are excited about it. This prospect of economic prosperity is something that I think he takes very seriously, and he is very proud of and wants to be able to point to his accomplishments. As I've often said, he wants to be able to hold up the piece of paper and say, check out that 5% GDP. And now we all know what GDP is, right? Molly, other accomplishments, the fact that he's really had a significant effect on the Supreme Court. How big a deal is that?
Yeah, he was able to do a lot from his perch in the executive branch, not just the nomination of Gorsuch. He managed to nominate someone who is more conservative than Scalia, or as conservative as Scalia, a real stalwart. We have yet to see exactly how this will work on the court, but not just Gorsuch, but all these other judicial nominations at the lower court level that will become the next Supreme Court justices in the years to come. And the regulatory, another thing he did in his position at the executive branch was really pulling back on so much regulatory overreach. It's really a hugely impressive story that has a lot to do with the confidence that people have in the economy. And he had said he wanted to get rid of 2 regulations for every new one passed. It's something more like 20-1 for the first time. There's an actual, in a long time, there's a cut in the number of pages of regulations we have and the number of regulations we have. And this is the type of stuff that very much helps small businessmen and large businessmen and people who are trying to make a go of and have a better life for them and their families. And so that's a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, no, people want to feel secure. They want to feel economically secure, and they want to feel physically secure. So another accomplishment perhaps you could point to, and Wendy, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, is what he's done to ward off the threat of ISIS. And, you know, we've shown the maps right here on this show where you look at what it was just a year ago when he first came into office, how much territory ISIS controlled. You look at the territory they control today, and it's really just a sliver of what they had. Regardless of what party you're from, is that, or is that not an accomplishment?
It is an accomplishment, and as you rightfully said, it is a sliver. But let's talk about some of the things that he promised that he hasn't done. He said he will drain the swamp. He has not done that. He said he will build a wall. He has not done that. And let me just underscore the fact that Obama, his first year, when he was looking at Afghanistan and Iran, he had bipartisan support. And that is the big needle in the side of this president, is that he lacks that bipartisan support. He does not have the support of the Dems. And right now, our country is even more divisive, more intolerant than ever. And that's something that he has to focus on moving into 2018, because when we're looking at infrastructure, when we're looking at the possibility of creating a wall, he will need the Democrats to come along. And if he continues to create division, he can't do that.
Infrastructure. They're going to spend other people's money. They ought to love this one, Rachel. Infrastructure. Yeah. They've been talking about it forever. I don't know how he couldn't get the Democrats involved in that. And if they didn't want to, well, that might come back to haunt them.
Well, and I'll say one of the advantages that Donald Trump has, or President Trump has now, is that he's not ideological, that he really has just an America first agenda. And so he's not tied to any of the ideology on the left or the right. He's going to do what he thinks is going to make the country more prosperous and safer, because I think those are the two things that he's betting on for re-election.
What does that mean then when it comes to dealing with North Korea? You may have heard me earlier with Ambassador Bolton, and you know, he said, look, Trish, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, you really think they're going to be okay with us having a trade war with China? To which I say, to heck with Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. And why are we allowing Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan to be the ones controlling what is best for our destiny as Americans? Why should they control what the president's doing? So how do you think President Trump, who says, look, I may have to re-examine this trade situation with China, how's he going to deal with China in trying to get them what he needs to get them to do with North Korea?
You know, I think so.
Maybe over to Molly first, and then Rachel.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you hear Donald Trump's rhetoric, it's reasonable to think that he's going to be some big protectionist, or that he doesn't like free trade. And you're hearing these rumblings that he wants to start a trade war. I don't actually think that's true, because so much of the success that he's had has been because of this strong economy and the confidence that people have. And while he certainly might want to renegotiate some trade agreements, and he seems more interested in bilateral trade agreements where you just have one other country that you're working with as opposed to the more expansive ones, I don't see a big trade war in our future.
But I'm talking about trade as it relates to security. I mean, I think the security is utmost and important.
Yeah, on that point, there is a lot more that can be done to squeeze China to get it to take North Korea more seriously. People keep saying, oh, we're running out of options. We're not running out of options. There are so many tougher sanctions that we could impose, and we could definitely use our economic strength to help them see that that would be in their best interest.
Thank you, Molly, for saying that. I'm sorry, Wendy, quickly, last word to you, and then I got to run.
No, I was going to say that, you know, we have to make sure that even though we want to be America first, we cannot isolate ourselves. We cannot work in a vacuum. We need our allies. And in order for us to have our allies, we have to make sure that our president continues to be diplomatic. And that's, again, a sore that he's not doing.
So good to see all you guys. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to
you. Happy New Year.
Coming up next, the woman whose first-class seat was given to Sheila Jackson Lee is firing back at the Democratic Congresswoman's accusations of racism. Gianno Caldwell and Michael Starr Hopkins are here, and they're going to take that one on next. Have you ever spent a day at a farmer's market? For a lot of people, it's a great way to buy food directly from farms. It gives you know, the local economy a little bit of a boost, and hey, maybe it gives you something to do with your family, and obviously some nice things to cook. Well, according to two San Diego State professors, if you visit one, you are essentially, wait for it, a racist. In a new book, they write, quote, farmers markets are often white spaces where the food consumption habits of white people are normalized, leading to social exclusion. So what are we supposed to make of this? John Caldwell is a Fox News political analyst, and Michael Starr Hopkins is a Democratic strategist who, by the way, may soon be running for Senate in New Jersey. I'll leave that till later. Yes? Yes? Happening?
Yeah, I think it's happening.
All right, all right. Well, let me start first with Jono. Farmers market. Now they're attacking farmers markets?
Yeah, I know. And honestly, I'm disgusted with white liberals who will label something racist that happens to be innocuous. I think it disenfranchised real racism that happened or has happened in our country that has impacted millions of folks, African Americans. We can talk about the '94 crime bill with Hillary Clinton. We can talk about Dodd-Frank, which marginalized black banks and disallowed folks to get mortgages, which was African Americans get their loans from community banks in high numbers. So we can talk about the very real things. This isn't one of those things. And I'm just really disgusted with this continuation of labeling things, really distracting from the real issues that impact our country.
So leave it to these university professors, Michael, to come up with this one.
Yeah, I don't think this one's a helpful conversation topic. You know, I think that we can talk about gentrification and how it's affecting urban cities, but to label, farmers markets as racist, I think it's just lazy and it does a disservice to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, look, farmers markets, I would also say, look, you see farmers markets perhaps more in more rural type communities as opposed to in urban, although they have a lot of them in New York City as well. It's once again, this sort of craziness coming out of academia. But it's not just academia, shall we say. It's also Washington, D.C., courtesy of Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. You saw her statement, right? This is the woman, of course, who got the United Airlines seat that it was supposed to be for another woman who had purchased that first-class seat. And the woman who purchased the seat, she got really mad because, of course, she saw somebody else had taken her seat, and she didn't know who she was. But anyway, she made kind of a little bit of a stink about it and became a big story. And Sheila Jackson Lee says, basically, this is racism. She's calling racism on this one. She said, since this was not any fault of mine, the way the individual continued to act appeared to be, upon reflection, because I was an African-American woman, seemingly an easy target with the African-American flight attendant. Huh? Jono? What? Like it takes kind of a leap of faith to even understand or follow her logic here.
Yeah, I think Sheila Jackson Lee is doing a disservice to the Congressional Black Caucus, especially some of the issues that they need to work on and them losing continuous power. So I think that's certainly a disservice. I think that we've come to a place where they may call my shoes racist because the bottom of them happen to be black. So I'm walking on my shoes, and that could be considered racist. So that's problematic. I think this passenger, I would have complained to if U.S. Senator Michael Starr Hopkins took my first class
Got a nice
seat.
ring to it.
I'm going to complain. I'm going to get on Twitter. I'm going to get on Twitter, and I'm going to discuss it. And I think that's what that passenger did.
Last word to you, Michael.
I'll just say in 2018, I really hope both sides, whether you're Democrat or Republican, we can choose our words carefully and be a lot more thoughtful because we need to have real conversations about race relations in this country.
Sounds like a campaign speech. All right. Good luck on it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll be right back. Good to see you guys. Much for being part of the story this week. I've certainly had a great time. My thanks to Martha for letting me sit here with you all week. I hope you have a wonderful and very happy New Year. You can watch me tomorrow, 11 a.m. for Bulls and Bears. I'll see you there. And on Sunday, Brian's Next.